The world is not as we wish it to be. This is the first truth that must be accepted by anyone who seeks to navigate the treacherous waters of human interaction without being pulled under by the currents of toxicity that swirl around us. We enter life imagining that goodness will be met with goodness, that fairness will prevail, that reason will triumph over chaos. Then we encounter them. The manipulators, the energy vampires, the narcissists, the backstabbers, the passive-aggressives, the gaslighters, the power-hungry, the vindictive. They teach us, often painfully, that the world operates according to principles far removed from the idealistic notions we once cherished. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this reality 5 centuries ago when he wrote his infamous treatise on power. Though history has painted him as a villain, a teacher of evil, he was simply a realist who dared to describe the world as it actually functions, rather than as we pretend it should function. His insights were not celebrations of cruelty, but observations of human nature, stripped of its pretenses. When he advised his prince on maintaining power, he was articulating eternal truths about how people behave when their masks slip, when their interests are threatened, when their true natures emerge from beneath the veneer of civilization. The toxic person is a predator in the social ecosystem. They have refined their methods over years, perhaps decades, of getting what they want at others' expense. They have studied, consciously or unconsciously, the weaknesses in human psychology. They know how to identify those who can be manipulated, those who can be controlled, those who can be destroyed. They understand that most people are governed by fear, by the need for approval, by the desire to avoid conflict, by the weakness of their own unexamined beliefs about themselves. The toxic person exploits these vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a warlord. But here is where most people make their fatal error. They believe that the way to handle toxic people is through continued goodness, through patience, through understanding, through the application of the very principles that the toxic person has already identified as weaknesses to be exploited. They think that if they just explain themselves better, if they just show more kindness, if they just set one more boundary, the toxic person will suddenly have a revelation and change their behavior. This is fantasy. This is the thinking of someone who has not yet accepted the fundamental nature of the game being played. Machiavelli's genius lay in his recognition that different situations required different responses. The rules that govern interactions between honorable people do not apply when dealing with those who have no honor. The strategies that work in cooperative environments fail catastrophically when employed against adversaries who view every interaction as a zero-sum game. To deal with toxic people using the tools of normal human decency is like bringing a knife to a gunfight. It demonstrates courage, perhaps, but it guarantees defeat. Yet there is something even more fundamental than learning Machiavellian strategies for dealing with external threats. Before one can effectively neutralize the toxic people in one's environment, one must first address the toxic elements within oneself. This is the great secret that separates those who master their circumstances from those who remain perpetual victims. A man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the very vulnerabilities that toxic people exploit. He has removed the handles by which manipulators grab hold of his emotions, his decisions, his sense of reality. Consider what makes a person vulnerable to toxic manipulation. It is not strength that leaves one open to attack. It is weakness. The need for external validation, the fear of being alone, the inability to trust one's own perceptions, the addiction to being needed, the desperate clinging to relationships that have long since turned poisonous, the refusal to accept uncomfortable truths about people we want to love, the paralysis induced by our own niceness, the inability to act decisively when action is required. These are the weaknesses that must be destroyed within ourselves before we can hope to deal effectively with those who would destroy us from without. The process of self-destruction, properly understood, is not about becoming cruel or losing one's humanity. It is about eliminating the false self, the weak self, the self that has been constructed from fear and social conditioning and unexamined assumptions. It is about burning away everything in your character that makes you easy prey. Most people spend their entire lives building and maintaining a self that is designed to be liked, to be approved of, to fit in, to avoid conflict. This self is a liability in a world where toxic people exist. This self must be destroyed deliberately and systematically if one is to survive and thrive in environments where predators hunt. The toxic person recognizes weakness instinctively. They can sense the person who needs to be liked, who will absorb abuse to maintain peace, who will doubt their own reality when challenged, who will sacrifice their own interests to avoid being seen as difficult. These qualities, which our society often praises as virtues, Agreeableness, selflessness, conflict avoidance, benefit of the doubt become weapons in the hands of those skilled in manipulation. The toxic person does not see your kindness as something to be reciprocated. They see it as something to be exploited until there is nothing left to take. In the cold calculus of Machiavellian thinking, every interaction is an exchange of power. Either you gain ground or you lose it. Either you control the frame of the relationship or someone else does. Either you establish the terms of engagement or you accept the terms imposed upon you. The person who enters this game unprepared, who insists on playing by rules that their opponent has no intention of following, has already lost. This is not cynicism. It is clear-eyed recognition of reality. But here is the empowering truth that emerges from this harsh analysis. Once you understand the game, once you accept its rules, once you develop the skills necessary to play it effectively, you become nearly invulnerable. The toxic person's power derives entirely from your weaknesses. Remove those weaknesses, and their power evaporates. They can only manipulate if you can be manipulated. They can only gaslight if you doubt your own perception. They can only exploit your empathy if you extend it indiscriminately. They can only drain your energy if you allow them access to it. The transformation required is both simple and profound. It requires that you look honestly at every part of yourself that flinches, that compromises, that accommodates, that explains, that justifies, that seeks approval from those unworthy to give it. It requires that you identify every belief you hold that makes you vulnerable. Beliefs about being nice, about giving people chances, about being fair when the other person has already abandoned fairness, about maintaining relationships that should be ended, about owing explanations to those who have demonstrated they will only use your words against you. Think of the person who continues to engage with a toxic family member out of obligation. They endure abuse, manipulation, and emotional devastation because they believe that family loyalty demands this sacrifice. But what is this belief except a weakness that can be exploited? The toxic family member knows you will keep coming back. They know you will keep trying. They know you will never truly cut them off because you are imprisoned by a concept, family, that they have already violated in every meaningful way. Your adherence to the principle is your vulnerability. Their freedom from the principle is their power over you. Or consider the employee who tolerates a toxic boss because they believe that hard work and merit will eventually be recognized. Month after month, year after year, they absorb criticism. They accept blame for others' failures. They work overtime without compensation. They sacrifice their mental health and personal life, all while maintaining the belief that fairness will prevail. But the toxic boss has no intention of being fair. They have found someone who will produce results without requiring proper treatment in return. The employee's faith in meritocracy is the chain that binds them to their exploitation. These examples illustrate a principle that Machiavelli understood deeply. People are controlled by their beliefs more than by external force. The toxic person need not physically restrain their victims. They need only maintain the victim's belief in certain ideas, certain obligations, certain social contracts that the toxic person themselves has no intention of honoring. The manipulation succeeds because the victim continues to operate according to rules that the manipulator has already broken. The destruction of the weak self begins with the destruction of these limiting beliefs. It requires a willingness to question everything you have been taught about how you should behave, what you owe to others, what constitutes appropriate responses to inappropriate treatment. It requires that you examine every place where you sacrifice yourself not because it serves any higher purpose, but because you are afraid of what others will think if you don't. It requires that you distinguish between genuine morality and the performance of morality, between real compassion and the compulsive need to be seen as compassionate. This process is painful. The weak self does not die easily. It will fight for its survival with every rationalization, every justification, every appeal to who you think you should be rather than who you must become. It will tell you that you are becoming cold, that you are losing your humanity, that you are turning into the very thing you despise. These are lies designed to keep you weak, to keep you exploitable, to keep you in a state where toxic people can continue to feed on your energy and resources. The truth is precisely the opposite. By destroying the weak self, you liberate the strong self that has always existed beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. You do not become less human, you become more authentically yourself. You do not lose your capacity for love, you gain the ability to direct it toward those who deserve it rather than squandering it on those who will only abuse it. You do not become cruel. You become immune to cruelty. You do not become manipulative. You become impossible to manipulate. When this transformation is complete, when you have systematically eliminated every vulnerability that made you prey, something remarkable happens. Toxic people lose interest in you. They are predators who hunt the weak. When you are no longer weak, you are no longer interesting to them. They move on to easier targets, to those who still flinch, who still seek approval, who still can be controlled through fear or guilt or obligation. You become what Machiavelli called a difficult target, someone who costs more to attack than any potential victory is worth. But this is not merely a defensive posture. The person who has destroyed their weak self does not simply repel toxic people. They neutralize them when necessary. They understand that sometimes the only way to deal with a predator is to become predator oneself, to adopt the very strategies that were once used against them, to fight fire with fire in a way that is both strategic and decisive. This is where Machiavelli's specific tactical advice becomes invaluable. Once you have fortified yourself internally, once you have removed your own weaknesses, you can then employ his methods for handling external threats without falling into the trap of becoming what you oppose. The distinction is crucial. The toxic person uses manipulation because it is their nature. They are fundamentally parasitic, fundamentally destructive, fundamentally unable to create value, except by stealing it from others. The person who employs Machiavellian tactics against them does so strategically, temporarily, and with full self-awareness. They understand that certain situations require certain responses. They do not become toxic themselves. They become fluent in the language of power that toxic people understand, wielding it precisely and purposefully to neutralize threats and establish boundaries that cannot be violated. This is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Before learning the specific rules and tactics, before studying the methods of manipulation and counter-manipulation, before engaging in the strategic warfare that dealing with toxic people often requires, you must first complete the great work of internal transformation. You must kill every part of yourself that can be killed by others. You must eliminate every belief that makes you vulnerable. You must forge yourself into something that cannot be broken because you have already broken yourself and rebuilt yourself stronger. Only then can you truly beat them at their own game. Only then can you deploy Machiavellian strategies without being corrupted by them. Only then can you move through a world full of predators without becoming either victim or monster. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This is not just a philosophical statement, but a practical reality that can be achieved through systematic self-examination and ruthless elimination of weakness. Part 2. The Machiavellian Arsenal. With the foundation established, with the weak self destroyed and the strong self forged in its place, we turn now to the specific strategies that Machiavelli's work suggests for handling those who would seek to manipulate, control, or destroy us. These are not abstract principles, but practical techniques that have been tested across centuries of human conflict. They work because they are based on accurate observations of human nature, rather than wishful thinking about how people should behave. The first and most fundamental rule is this: never reveal the full extent of your strength until it becomes necessary to use it. Machiavelli advised his prince to be like the fox and the lion, cunning when cunning is required, ferocious when ferocity becomes necessary. The toxic person expects that they have correctly assessed your capabilities, your willingness to fight, your thresholds of tolerance. They have pushed you before and you have yielded, so they assume you will always yield. They have tested your boundaries and found them permeable, so they assume you have no real boundaries at all. This misperception is your greatest weapon. The moment you reveal your true strength prematurely, you lose the advantage of surprise. The toxic person will adjust their tactics, probe for other weaknesses, or simply withdraw temporarily to regroup. But if you allow them to maintain their false belief in your weakness right up until the moment you decisively demonstrate your power, they have no time to adapt. The psychological impact of this reversal is devastating to them. They have invested time and energy into a particular approach, convinced it was working, only to discover suddenly and completely that they had been mistaken about who they were dealing with. Consider the employee who has endured months of abuse from a toxic colleague, absorbing insults and credit stealing without apparent response. The toxic colleague has concluded that this person is weak, unable to fight back, perhaps even unaware of what is happening. Then, at a strategically chosen moment, perhaps during a crucial meeting or performance review, the seemingly weak employee produces documented evidence of every transgression, delivered calmly and comprehensively to decision-makers. The toxic colleague is not just defeated but humiliated, caught completely off guard precisely because they misread the situation so thoroughly. This principle extends to emotional reactions as well. A toxic person feeds on your emotional responses. They say provocative things to get you angry, make accusations to get you defensive, create drama to get you engaged. Every emotional reaction you display gives them information about what affects you and reinforcement for their behavior. The person who has destroyed their weak self has also destroyed the need to respond emotionally to provocations. They have learned what Machiavelli knew, that appearing less capable, less affected, less aware than you actually are can be a tremendous advantage. There is a technique in martial arts where you appear to be falling when you are actually setting up a throw, where you seem vulnerable when you are most dangerous. The same principle applies in psychological warfare. The toxic person who believes they have successfully manipulated you, who thinks their gaslighting has worked, who assumes their guilt trips have achieved their purpose, is a person operating with false information. They will overreach. They will get sloppy. They will expose themselves. And when they do, you strike with the full force you have been concealing. The second rule derives from Machiavelli's observation that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. In normal relationships with normal people, love or mutual respect is the appropriate foundation, but the toxic person respects only power. They have no capacity for genuine affection, no understanding of mutual benefit, no conception of fair exchange. They understand only dominance and submission, predator and prey. If you try to be loved by them, try to win them over with kindness, try to appeal to their better nature, you are playing the wrong game entirely. What they must learn to fear is not your anger. Anger is an emotion they can manipulate, but the consequences that you are willing and able to impose. The consequence might be exposure, where their behavior is documented and revealed to others whose opinion they care about. It might be exclusion, where you cut off their access to whatever resource you provide: attention, emotional labor, professional collaboration, social connection. It might be retaliation, where you respond to their attacks with calculated counterattacks that damage their interests. It might be simple withdrawal, where you remove yourself so completely from their sphere that they can no longer affect you in any way. The key is that the consequence must be real, meaningful, and actually implemented. The toxic person has learned to identify bluffs. They have encountered people who threaten boundaries but never enforce them, who make ultimatums but always back down, who talk about consequences but never deliver them. Empty threats do not inspire fear. They inspire contempt. If you say that certain behavior will result in certain consequences, you must follow through exactly as stated, every time, without exception. This is how you train the toxic person to fear you, by demonstrating through action that you mean precisely what you say. There is a corollary to this rule that Machiavelli would appreciate. When you do impose consequences, do so decisively and completely. Half measures communicate uncertainty. Gradual escalation gives the toxic person time to adjust, to negotiate, to manipulate. The most effective consequence is the one that comes swiftly, unexpectedly, and with finality. This creates a deterrent effect that extends beyond the immediate situation. Other potentially toxic people in your environment learn from the example. They see what happens when someone crosses you, and they decide they would rather not test whether you would do the same to them. This is not about cruelty for its own sake. It is about efficiency. The cleanest way to handle a toxic person is to make an example of them so complete that no one else will be tempted to behave similarly. One decisive action prevents the need for dozens of smaller conflicts down the road. Machiavelli understood that perceived ruthlessness could be more moral than the alternative if it prevented greater suffering through its deterrent effect. The third rule concerns information asymmetry. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of understanding your adversaries better than they understand you. The toxic person is accustomed to being the one who withholds information, who operates in shadows, who knows more about you than you realize. They have studied you, identified your patterns, learned your weaknesses. Most people never think to study toxic people with the same analytical rigor. This is a critical error. Everything the toxic person says is data. Everything they do reveals something about their strategy. Every manipulation attempt shows you which of your buttons they think they can push. If you are paying attention, if you are documenting patterns, if you are analyzing their behavior with cold objectivity, you begin to develop a comprehensive understanding of how they operate. You learn their tells, the subtle signs that indicate when they are lying, when they are testing boundaries, when they are setting up a larger manipulation. You identify their triggers, what threatens them, what they truly care about, what they fear losing. Meanwhile, you give them nothing. You volunteer no information about your thoughts, your plans, your capabilities, your intentions. You become opaque to them while they become transparent to you. This reversal of the usual information dynamic is profoundly disorienting for toxic people. They are accustomed to being the ones who know more, who see more, who understand more. When they realize that someone has been observing them with the same predatory attention they usually direct at others, it fundamentally unsettles them. This intelligence gathering must be systematic and disciplined. Keep a detailed record of interactions. Dates, times, exactly what was said, what happened, who was present. Document everything in writing when possible. Maintain a log of patterns that emerge over time. This serves multiple purposes. First, it protects you against gaslighting, where the toxic person tries to convince you that things didn't happen the way you remember. Your documentation proves otherwise. Second, it provides evidence if you need to make a formal complaint or legal case. Third, the very act of documenting forces you to remain objective and analytical rather than purely emotional in your response. But perhaps most importantly, this systematic observation allows you to predict what the toxic person will do next. Once you understand their pattern, once you have mapped their usual sequence of manipulation, you can see their moves before they make them. You can prepare countermoves. You can set traps. You can manipulate the manipulator by feeding them information that will lead them to make predictable mistakes. The person who is being observed and doesn't know it is at a catastrophic disadvantage against someone who has studied them thoroughly. The fourth rule addresses timing and momentum. Machiavelli knew that when to act is often more important than how to act. The toxic person relies on catching you off balance, striking when you are vulnerable, exploiting moments when your defenses are down. They launch their attacks when you are dealing with other problems, when you are tired, when you are isolated. Understanding this pattern allows you to reverse it. You choose the time and place of engagement. You strike when they are vulnerable, when they are overconfident, when they have made mistakes that can be exploited. You refuse to fight on their timetable, when they try to create urgency, demanding immediate responses, forcing quick decisions, creating artificial crises. You deliberately slow things down. You impose your own tempo on the conflict. This is deeply frustrating for toxic people who are accustomed to controlling the pace of interaction. There is a specific technique here that proves devastatingly effective: the delayed response. When the toxic person sends a provocative message, makes an unreasonable demand, or launches an attack, the conditioned response is to react immediately. They expect this. They are prepared for it. They have planned their next move based on your predicted emotional reaction. Instead, you respond on your schedule, after you have had time to think, to plan, to craft a response that serves your strategic interests rather than their manipulation. This might mean waiting hours, days, or even weeks to respond to something that they have framed as urgent. During this delay, they experience uncertainty. They wonder if their manipulation worked. They question whether they pushed too hard. They lose sleep while you remain calm. And when your response finally comes, it is measured, strategic, and devastating precisely because it has not been contaminated by emotional reactivity. The fifth rule concerns alliances and isolation. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of understanding who your true allies are and ensuring that your enemies cannot unite against you. Toxic people often operate by isolating their victims, cutting them off from support systems, creating situations where the victim feels alone and powerless. If you find yourself dealing with a toxic person, one of your first priorities must be to ensure that you are not isolated. This means building and maintaining strong relationships with others who can serve as witnesses, supporters, and validators of reality. When the toxic person tries to gaslight you, these allies confirm that your perception is accurate. When the toxic person tries to spread lies about you, these allies provide counter-narrative. When the toxic person tries to turn others against you, these allies remain loyal because they have direct experience of your character. But the strategic imperative goes beyond mere defense. You must also work to isolate the toxic person from their own support systems. This is not about destroying innocent relationships, but about ensuring that those who might otherwise enable or defend the toxic person understand the truth of their behavior. You do this through careful, documented exposure. When the toxic person has behaved badly, you ensure that the right people know about it. When they lie, You correct the record. When they try to manipulate others, you warn those people about the tactics being used. The goal is not to engage in a smear campaign, but to ensure that truth flows more freely than lies. Toxic people rely on information control. They need others to believe their version of events, to not compare notes with their various victims, to remain ignorant of their full pattern of behavior. Your job is to prevent this information control without appearing to be the aggressor. You simply ensure that people have access to facts, to documentation, to patterns. You let the evidence speak for itself. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a toxic person's manipulations fail, because you have quietly ensured that their usual tactics are now known to those they would deploy them against. They try to triangulate, but the people they approach have already been briefed. They try to spread rumors, but everyone knows to discount their claims. They try to find allies, but no one wants to be associated with someone whose behavior has been so thoroughly documented and exposed. Their power evaporates, not through direct confrontation, but through the systematic dismantling of the conditions that allowed them to operate. The sixth rule concerns the management of reputation. Machiavelli understood that perception often matters more than reality in human affairs. The toxic person knows this too and works hard to maintain a public image that contradicts their private behavior. They are charming to outsiders while being cruel to their victims. They perform generosity in public while being exploitative in private. They cultivate relationships with authority figures who never see their true nature. Your task is twofold. First, maintain your own reputation with scrupulous care. Be impeccable in your dealings with everyone else. Build a track record of reliability, integrity, and reasonableness with those who matter. This serves as a buffer when the toxic person inevitably tries to damage your reputation. If everyone knows you as someone reasonable and truthful, the toxic person's accusations will lack credibility. If you are known for emotional stability, their attempts to paint you as unstable will fail. Second, carefully undermine the toxic person's false reputation by creating situations where their true nature becomes visible to others. This cannot be done through accusation or complaint. That makes you look like the problem. It must be done by engineering circumstances where the toxic person's behavior speaks for itself. You ask reasonable questions in public that they cannot answer honestly without exposing themselves. You create situations where their incompetence or manipulation becomes undeniable. You ensure that others directly experience what you have been experiencing, while you maintain perfect professional composure. This is a delicate operation requiring patience and subtlety. The toxic person must not realize they are being exposed. They must think they are operating as usual, while gradually more people see through their facade. Over time, their reputation erodes, while yours strengthens. Eventually, a tipping point is reached where the consensus turns against them. They find themselves isolated, distrusted, diminished. And because this has happened gradually, through their own revealed behavior, rather than through your advocacy, they have no one to blame but themselves, and no way to reverse the damage. The seventh rule addresses the question of when to engage and when to withdraw. Machiavelli knew that some battles are not worth fighting, that discretion is often the better part of valor. Not every toxic person in your life requires active confrontation. Sometimes the most Machiavellian move is to simply remove them from your life completely and permanently, with no explanation, no warning, no opportunity for negotiation. This is particularly relevant for toxic relationships that exist primarily through your own permission, family members you are not obligated to see, former friends who add no value to your life, romantic partners who are destructive. In these cases, the most powerful move is the clean cut. You disappear from their life as completely as they once existed in it. No drama, no final confrontation, no explanation that they can twist and use against you. Simply absence where there was once presence. The toxic person is often unprepared for this. They are accustomed to victims who keep coming back, who can be hoovered back into relationship, who can be manipulated into giving second chances. When someone simply vanishes and cannot be contacted or manipulated into returning, it represents a total loss of power for the toxic person. They have been deleted from your reality as thoroughly as a virus is deleted from a computer. This requires absolute commitment, no response to messages, no acknowledgement of attempts at contact, no weakness when they try to use others as intermediaries, no explanation that they can argue with or use to reopen connection. Complete silence, complete absence, complete unavailability. This is the ultimate boundary, not a line in the sand, but a void that cannot be crossed because you are no longer there to be reached. To toxic people who cannot be entirely removed from your life, certain family members, workplace colleagues, unavoidable community contacts, the principle still applies in modified form. You become minimally available. You provide only what is absolutely required and nothing more. You transform yourself from a full relationship into a transactional interaction. They learn that trying to engage with you beyond the bare minimum yields nothing but professional courtesy or polite refusal. The eighth rule concerns the deployment of their own tactics against them. Machiavelli would appreciate the poetic justice in using a toxic person's own weapons to defeat them. Once you understand their methods thoroughly, once you have documented their patterns and identified their vulnerabilities, you can employ those same methods strategically. This is not about becoming toxic yourself. Remember, you are wielding these tools with full consciousness and strategic purpose, not as your default mode of operation. If they gaslight, you can selectively introduce doubt into their perception of reality through carefully placed questions and observations. If they triangulate, you can create situations where their various lies to different people become revealed and contradictory. If they use guilt, you can reflect that guilt back onto them for their behavior. If they use charm to manipulate others, you can expose the gap between their charm and their actions. If they use intimidation, you can remain so unmoved that their attempts escalate into behavior that others can see clearly as inappropriate. The key is proportionality and purpose. You are not doing this as revenge or from wounded ego. You are doing it to neutralize a threat, to establish deterrence, to communicate in a language they understand that you are not a target they can afford to keep pursuing. There is a particular effectiveness in showing toxic people that you are capable of doing to them exactly what they do to others, but choosing not to unless they make it necessary. This revelation, that you have been capable all along of fighting on their level but have been choosing not to, can be more unsettling to them than any single action you might take. The ninth rule addresses the importance of maintaining emotional detachment, even while engaged in conflict. Machiavelli's prince was most effective when acting from cold calculation rather than hot emotion. The toxic person wants you angry, wants you scared, wants you hurt. These emotional states cloud judgment and lead to mistakes. They also provide the toxic person with evidence that their attacks are landing, which reinforces their behavior. The person who has destroyed their weak self has also largely destroyed their vulnerability to these emotional manipulations. They have learned to recognize attempts at emotional provocation for what they are: tactics, not genuine engagement. They can observe their own emotional reactions with detachment, allowing feelings to arise but not allowing those feelings to dictate their responses. There is a vast difference between feeling anger and acting from anger. The former is unavoidable and human. The latter is optional and usually strategic. This emotional discipline must be absolute when dealing with toxic people. No matter how provocative they are, no matter how much they push, you remain calm, measured, and strategic in your responses. This infuriates them because it denies them the reaction they seek. It also elevates you in the eyes of others who witness the interaction. You appear reasonable, mature, and controlled, while the toxic person's behavior becomes increasingly visible as they escalate in frustration at their inability to provoke you. There is a meditative quality to this state that can be cultivated through practice. You watch the toxic person as you might watch a fascinating but dangerous animal in a zoo, with interest but without personal investment in their display. They are not acting on you so much as revealing themselves through their actions. Your detachment is not indifference, but a higher level of engagement where you are operating strategically rather than reactively. The 10th and final rule concerns endgame strategy. Machiavelli understood that different situations call for different ultimate objectives. Sometimes the goal is simply to escape a toxic situation intact. Sometimes it is to neutralize the toxic person's power. Sometimes it is to defeat them so decisively that they never recover their ability to harm you or others. You must be clear about which outcome you are pursuing and tailor your tactics accordingly. For escape, you need an exit plan that minimizes damage and prevents pursuit. For neutralization, you need to remove the toxic person's access to resources and relationships that give them power over you. For decisive defeat, you need to systematically dismantle their position, reputation, and support system until they are no longer capable of mounting effective attacks. Each requires different tactics and different levels of commitment. The error many people make is pursuing escape when neutralization is required, or attempting neutralization when decisive defeat is necessary. They leave the toxic person wounded, but not defeated, angry but not powerless, contained but not eliminated as a threat. This leads to situations where the conflict drags on, where the toxic person continues to probe for weaknesses, where victory is never final. Machiavelli's advice here is ruthlessly practical. If you are going to move against someone, move with enough force to ensure that they cannot recover and strike back. Half measures create enemies who are dangerous precisely because they are wounded. Either avoid confrontation entirely through escape, or commit fully to victory through complete neutralization or defeat. The middle ground is where most people fail, and where toxic people are most dangerous. Part 3. The Invincible Self. We arrive now at the synthesis of internal transformation and external strategy, at the point where the person who has destroyed their weak self and mastered Machiavellian tactics becomes something greater than either component alone. This is the invincible self. Not invincible in the sense of being impervious to all harm, but invincible in the sense of having achieved a state where the toxic people of the world can no longer fundamentally damage who you are or derail what you are building. The invincible self is not created through a single moment of transformation, but through sustained practice of the principles we have discussed. It emerges gradually as you consistently apply these lessons across multiple situations with different toxic people. Each encounter becomes easier than the last, not because toxic people become less toxic, but because you become increasingly immune to their tactics. What once devastated you now barely registers. What once consumed weeks of your mental energy now is resolved in moments. What once left you questioning your sanity now is immediately recognized for what it is: manipulation that you are entirely capable of countering. This progression toward invincibility follows a predictable pattern. At first, you will recognize toxic behavior only in retrospect, understanding too late that you were being manipulated. You will implement boundaries but enforce them inconsistently. You will make strategic moves but undermine them with residual guilt or excessive empathy. You will know intellectually what you should do, but find yourself emotionally unable to do it. This is normal. This is the weak self dying slowly, fighting for survival even as you systematically dismantle it. The breakthrough comes when recognition becomes real-time rather than retrospective. You are in the middle of an interaction with a toxic person and you suddenly see exactly what they are doing, exactly why they are doing it, exactly what they expect to achieve. In that moment of clarity, you have choice. You are no longer in the grip of automatic responses that they have counted on. You can decide whether to call them out, to counter-manipulate, to withdraw, to document, or to simply refuse to play along. The power shifts in that instant from them to you. As this skill develops, you begin to notice patterns earlier and earlier. You can identify toxic people before they have fully revealed themselves. You recognize the early warning signs that used to be invisible to you, the minor boundary violations that precede major ones, the small lies that indicate a pattern of dishonesty, the subtle put-downs that mask as jokes, the testing behaviors that probe for weakness. Where once you gave people the benefit of the doubt until they had done substantial damage, now you assess people carefully and maintain appropriate distance from those who display toxic characteristics. This is not cynicism, but discernment. You have not lost your faith in human goodness. You have gained the ability to distinguish between those who deserve your trust and those who have not earned it. You remain open to genuine connection while being closed to exploitation. You can still be kind without being naive, generous without being taken advantage of, forgiving without being foolish. The difference is that these qualities are now deployed consciously and strategically rather than reflexively and automatically. The invincible self understands something that the weak self never could, that not all people are operating with good intentions, that not all conflicts can be resolved through communication, that not all relationships should be preserved, that not everyone deserves your time, energy, or emotional investment. These truths, which once would have seemed harsh or cynical, now appear as simple statements of reality. There is no judgment in them, no bitterness, no disappointment, just clear-eyed recognition of what is. This acceptance brings a profound peace. You are no longer fighting against reality, no longer insisting that people should be different than they are, no longer exhausting yourself trying to change those who have no intention of changing. You see toxic people as toxic people and respond accordingly, with the same neutral efficiency you might bring to any other problem that needs solving. They are not personal affronts to your worldview, but simply obstacles to be navigated around, threats to be neutralized, or puzzles to be solved. The energy freed up by this shift is tremendous. Consider how much mental and emotional bandwidth you once devoted to toxic people, analyzing their behavior, trying to understand their motivations, seeking ways to appease them, recovering from their attacks, questioning yourself based on their feedback, maintaining relationships that drained you. All of that energy is now available for other purposes. You can invest it in relationships that actually nurture you, in work that actually fulfills you, in goals that actually matter to you. The invincible self also develops what might be called a gravitational pull. People begin to notice that you are different, that you operate according to principles they can sense but not quite articulate. Those who are healthy and genuine find themselves drawn to you because your clarity and strength are attractive qualities. Those who are toxic find themselves unable to get a grip on you and either maintain distance or are driven away by their repeated failure to manipulate you successfully. Your social ecosystem begins to change composition. Toxic people exit, either through your active removal of them or through their own choice to seek easier targets. Healthy people enter, attracted by the boundaries you maintain and the reciprocity you offer. Over time, you find yourself surrounded by people who add value to your life rather than subtracting from it, who operate with integrity rather than manipulation, who see relationships as mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. This transformation in your social environment is both cause and effect of your invincibility. The invincible self creates the healthy environment, and the healthy environment reinforces your invincibility. It becomes a positive feedback loop where each element strengthens the other. You become progressively more immune to toxicity while simultaneously encountering less of it. But here we must address a paradox. The person who becomes invincible through destroying their weak self and mastering strategic principles often finds that they rarely need to deploy the harsher tactics we have discussed. The strong do not need to constantly prove their strength. The person who is genuinely dangerous to toxic people does not need to advertise that danger. The mere presence of clear boundaries maintained consistently is often sufficient deterrent. This is because toxic people are fundamentally lazy. They are looking for easy victories, for prey that doesn't fight back, for relationships where they get maximum extraction with minimum effort. When they encounter someone who is going to make them work for every inch of ground, who is going to document everything, who is going to enforce consequences rigorously, who is clearly capable of escalation if necessary, they usually decide the target is not worth the effort. They may test once or twice, but when those tests fail, they typically move on. The battles you win without fighting are the most perfect victories. The toxic people you never have to confront because they self-select away from you are the easiest to handle.
The manipulations that never land because you have removed the vulnerabilities they would exploit are the simplest to manage. As you become increasingly invincible, you find yourself needing to actively fight less and less, not because there are fewer toxic people in the world, but because you have become unattractive as a target.
This state of being brings with it certain responsibilities and risks that must be acknowledged. The person who has achieved invincibility can become cold, can lose touch with their own capacity for vulnerability, can forget that not everyone needs to be assessed as friend or foe. There is a difference between being invincible and being closed. The goal is to be invincible to toxicity while remaining open to genuine connection. This balance requires ongoing attention and self-reflection. You must periodically examine yourself to ensure that you have not overcorrected, that in destroying your weak self, you have not also destroyed your capacity for authentic human connection with those who deserve it. The invincible self is not the isolated self. It is not the self that trusts no one and needs no one. It is the self that can distinguish accurately between threats and opportunities, between people who should be kept at distance and people who should be welcomed close. The way to maintain this balance is through what might be called calibrated vulnerability. With people who have earned your trust through consistent demonstration of their character, you can allow yourself to be vulnerable without being weak. You can express needs without being needy, show emotion without being manipulated through it, accept help without becoming dependent on it. This selective vulnerability is not a weakness but a strength. It allows for deep connection with worthy people while maintaining imperviousness to toxic people. You become like a castle with controlled access. The walls are high and strong, designed to keep out invaders. But there are gates that can open for those who belong inside. The key is that you control the gates. You decide who enters, and you can close those gates immediately if someone inside proves to be a threat. You are not locked inside your own fortress, unable to connect with anyone. You are the sovereign of a well-defended realm that welcomes friends and allies while repelling enemies and exploiters. As this mastery deepens, you may notice that you are able to handle toxic people with something approaching compassion, not the weak compassion that enables their behavior, but a stronger form of compassion that recognizes their toxicity as a kind of sickness even while refusing to be infected by it. You can understand that toxic people are often themselves victims of earlier trauma, caught in patterns they may not fully understand, suffering even as they cause others to suffer. This understanding does not make you vulnerable to them. You maintain your boundaries and enforce your consequences, but it removes any need for hatred or personal animosity. This compassionate detachment represents perhaps the highest form of invincibility. You can look at a toxic person not with fear or anger, but with a kind of neutral pity. You recognize that while you have done the hard work of destroying your weak self and rebuilding yourself stronger, they remain trapped in their toxicity, endlessly repeating patterns that prevent them from ever experiencing genuine connection or lasting peace. Your victory over them is complete not when you have destroyed them, but when you have so transcended what they represent that they can no longer affect you at all. This level of mastery also allows you to help others who are struggling with toxic people. You can share what you have learned, guide them through their own process of destroying their weak self, teach them the tactical principles that will allow them to protect themselves. But you must be careful here. Not everyone is ready to hear these lessons. Not everyone is willing to do the hard work of transformation. And some people are so invested in their victim identity that they will resist any attempt to help them become powerful. The invincible self recognizes this and does not waste energy trying to save those who are not ready to be saved. You can offer wisdom, but you cannot make anyone act on it. You can point the way, but you cannot walk the path for someone else. Each person must destroy their own weak self through their own effort. Your role is to be an example of what is possible, to demonstrate that invincibility can be achieved, and to assist those who are genuinely ready to undertake the journey. In your own life, the practice of invincibility becomes a daily discipline. You maintain your boundaries even when it would be easier to let them slide. You continue to observe people carefully even after you think you understand them. You document interactions that might be relevant later even when everything seems fine. You practice emotional regulation so that you can respond strategically in moments of provocation. You cultivate relationships with healthy people who strengthen your position. You remain financially and logistically independent to the greatest extent possible. You develop skills and resources that make you self-sufficient. All of these practices are forms of ongoing self-destruction. Not destruction in the sense of harm, but destruction in the sense of refusing to allow any weak self to reform. Every time you catch yourself seeking approval from someone unworthy of deciding your worth, you destroy that impulse. Every time you notice yourself making excuses for someone's toxic behavior, you destroy that rationalization. Every time you feel the pull to tolerate something intolerable, you destroy that conditioning. The work never ends completely, because the weak self is always trying to resurface, always attempting to justify its own return. But as time passes and the practice deepens, these moments of temptation become less frequent and less compelling. The invincible self becomes your default state, rather than something you have to consciously maintain. The boundaries you once had to remind yourself to enforce become automatic. The manipulation tactics you once had to analytically identify become immediately obvious at an almost instinctual level. The strategic thinking you once had to work at becomes your natural mode of operation. You reach a state where you can move through the world with a kind of relaxed alertness, not paranoid or hypervigilant, but calmly aware of the social dynamics around you and your own position within them. Toxic people become visible to you at a glance, like predators with poor camouflage. Their tactics seem transparent, almost comically obvious. You can predict their moves with accuracy because you have seen the patterns so many times before. And when you need to counter them, you can do so with minimal effort and maximum effectiveness. This is the state that Machiavelli would recognize as true power, not the crude power of aggression or domination, but the refined power of someone who understands human nature deeply, who has mastered themselves completely, and who can navigate any social situation with confidence and skill. You are not trying to control others in the way a toxic person does. You are simply ensuring that others cannot control you, while building exactly the life you want to live. The final realization that comes with complete invincibility is perhaps the most liberating. Toxic people are not actually that powerful. They are certainly dangerous to the weak, the naive, the unprepared. But to someone who has done the work, who has destroyed their own weaknesses, who understands the game being played, toxic people are manageable problems at worst, and irrelevant annoyances at best. Their manipulation only works on those who can be manipulated. Their gaslighting only affects those who doubt their own perception. Their exploitation only succeeds with those who can be exploited. When you are none of these things, when you have systematically eliminated every vulnerability they might target, they have no power over you at all. They may try, may scheme, may attack, but their attacks find no purchase. They expend energy while you remain unmoved. They escalate their behavior while you respond with measured precision. They eventually exhaust themselves against the fortress of your invincibility and either withdraw or destroy themselves through their own excess. This is the ultimate victory. Not defeating them through force, but rendering them irrelevant through your own transformation. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing in him left to destroy. He has already done to himself what they would do to him, but he has done it consciously, purposefully, in service of becoming stronger rather than weaker. The invincible self stands at the end of this journey, having integrated all the lessons, having mastered all the tactics, having completed the transformation from vulnerable prey to sovereign ruler of their own life. They have beaten toxic people at their own game, not by becoming toxic themselves, but by becoming immune to toxicity. They have achieved a state that is simultaneously soft and hard, open and defended, compassionate and strategic.